Welcome, listeners. Thanks for joining us today. A quick note, this is the first part of a two-part episode that will be released over the course of a couple weeks. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you get notified as soon as part 2 is released. One other note, this episode was recorded prior to the SEC's final ruling about greenhouse gas corporate disclosures, which were announced in March of this year. Hope you enjoy. Let's dive in. For today's episode, we welcome a very special guest, Dr. Michael Gillenwater. Dr. Gillenwater is a co-founder, executive director, and dean of the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, a nonprofit organization with the unique mission to train and professionalize a global community of experts for measuring, auditing, and managing greenhouse gas emissions. Beyond guiding the Institute's strategy and programming, Michael is also a thought leader and directs the Institute's curriculum development and educational initiatives. He's been a lead author for the Nobel Peace Prize winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, since 1999. He's also been engaged in the work of the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, was a core advisor and contributing author to the WRI Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency as a lead author of the United States Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory. Today, we speak with him about ideas including best practices for creating an inventory, explore resources for those needing more information about the process, and dive into a discussion about how an organization can even get started. Let's jump in. Welcome to the Carbon Accounting and Management Podcast, presented by North Star Carbon Management. I'm your host, Chris Barsman. If you're a professional responsible for managing your organization's carbon footprint, this podcast is for you. We bring you expert insights, emerging technologies, and actionable strategies to excel in the complex world of carbon management. Stay tuned for an enlightening conversation and real-world solutions. Let's jump in. First question, can I please get your official name and title?
Michael Gillenwater, and I am Executive Director at the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute.
Perfect. Thank you. And the second portion, what does the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute do specifically? And then how does your role fit into the organization?
Sure. The Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, we're a relatively small nonprofit organization that works internationally to essentially do professional development in the international kind of development space, what we call capacity building. So we do technical capacity building, so that like training and helping build up institutional systems in governments and business and nonprofits related to greenhouse gas, analysis, accounting, mitigation, what we call MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification. There's different terms used in different venues. A lot of our work is focused on the international compliance space. So this was, in the old days, it was Kyoto Protocol. These days, it's the Paris Agreement. But all that architecture within countries to do emissions reporting, to make sure that they're meeting their targets and commitments. But we also work a lot with businesses on how to analyze their emissions and track and set targets. Most importantly, what we do is we teach and we build capacity. We're not a consultancy that go out and does emission inventories or disclosure reports or sustainability reports for companies. We'll work with that company to help them train their staff to do that work. Or we also work with a lot of probably the consultants that do that work for companies. So we're the kind of the teachers, not the doers.
Gotcha. And your role specifically within the organization?
Yeah, so I founded the organization with some colleagues, and do all the things that a executive director or CEO does. I have specific roles in also helping guide our curriculum development. A big thing we've done over many years is have a kind of a pretty rigorous set of training resources, and we have like thousands of alumni all over the world working in governments and businesses and everywhere in between. And then also specifically lead our research program. So one of the things we try and do is be thought leaders in the space, kind of pushing forward the not just the how you do kind of GHG accounting and inventories, but also kind of the deeper thinking about like why we're doing it and some of the theoretical questions. For example, several years ago we did a whole deep dive series on what is additionality, a topic within the carbon offset markets. That's obviously still a struggling point, and I think we help shape the debate on how people think about that issue.
That's great, and the work that you folks do is amazing. Personally, I've learned a lot from you folks. I love reading a lot of the blogs that you folks put out. There's a lot of interesting conversations that happen there. I think for our listeners, it's you folks as a resource is absolutely fantastic. And with the recently passed Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, or California Senate Bill 253, I think we're getting into a situation now where we're going to be finding more and more organizations are now not just choosing to do carbon emission inventories, but are now being required to do so. And so with that in mind, if an organization has never considered doing one before, wants to put somebody in the organization onto the inventory, within an organization, who have you seen that you think is a good fit skill-wise to conduct these kind of inventories, and maybe it might be the best person to maybe potentially start taking the lead?
Sure, and like you said, we're seeing these kind of more mandatory corporate level reporting expand in a number of venues. Obviously, as you pointed out, California's recently passed bill signed by the governor, but also the Securities Exchange Commission in the U.S. is working on a proposed rule. We have existing rules that are recently put in place in Europe. So we're seeing this expand in a number of countries, focused on reporting by large kind of publicly invested companies primarily. So just for any of your listeners, these are typically not requirements for smaller businesses. These are for large businesses. But to your question, we get in a little bit of a tricky situation in that you increasingly, and that was sort of the basis of a lot of the GHG protocol. So this is the World Resources Institute, World Business Council Sustainable Development, WBCSD. The GHG protocol that sort of a lot of this is built on for corporate reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. It was, sort of founded on a premise that is trying to, in some ways, marry a little bit financial reporting and disclosure with this greenhouse gas emissions reporting and disclosure. It wasn't ever, they didn't really try and do a perfect marriage, but we increasingly see this kind of overlap between kind of traditional financial kind of risk investor just kind of disclosures and reporting venues and mechanisms with emissions. And I hate to say it, but my opinion is it's not the greatest fit in terms of the two. I mean, there are some significant differences between kind of tracking money in accounting software and tracking emissions. The latter, I would argue, tends to be much more the venue of kind of environmental engineers and people that are used to doing kind of those kinds of engineering estimates and understanding the chemistry and the physics of these things, and understanding how processes work and systems, doing systems diagrams and kind of the engineering systems diagrams and getting all that stuff straight. That I would argue that's probably the skill set that was probably most important to have. Obviously, a background in air pollution, air quality kind of helps you understand the underlying processes that create greenhouse gas emissions. So that's not to say that people from more of a financial or accounting background can't actively engage in this space. We've had alumni and training that have come from lots of different worlds, from legal to engineering to science to finance to accounting to and everything in between. You could learn those skills sort of regardless of your background. But I would say, it's a challenge for someone if you don't if you're not comfortable with chemical formulas and engineering estimation equations, and thinking in terms of kind of system boundaries, that it's probably going to be a little bit of a struggle to do this sort of work.
That's fair. And I kind of want to touch on the idea of how organizations use their financial reporting to do their emissions reporting. I've noticed, a lot of organizations will try to use spend-based mechanisms to at least initially get the ball rolling. A lot of times we say, you don't want to let perfect get in the way of progress. How do you find your recommendations for organizations as they try to strike that balance between maybe getting off the ground floor? Would you recommend that they start with financial-based reporting, and kind of at least let that be kind of step one, or do you think that's maybe a misstep and a missed opportunity for organizations? And what do you think about that conversation in general?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the original kind of approach to corporate reporting, it isn't a bad one to still stick with, which was, initially almost all the focus was on scope 1 reporting, so that I won't redefine it, but direct emissions from the company's own assets, and operations internally. So that is, you shouldn't need to use spin-based approaches to address that. Matter of fact, if you are doing that, then you're probably missing something, because the whole point would be to kind of actually understand your processes and why emissions are happening, and then think go to that next step, thinking about what you might do about them. So again, that would be very much much more of a technical kind of engineering type analysis. So when we get into spin-based stuff, now we're really talking about indirect emissions, the primarily scope 3, and then I guess, I mean, we're getting into a topic that I and some of my colleagues are deeply engaged in, is some of the rethinking that's going on into how we define essentially corporate inventory boundaries. So essentially, how far out in terms of scope 3 do you go? And obviously, the farther out you go, the more likely you're going to need to use some sort of financial or spin-based approach, because it's sort of, it's like your supplier kind of thing, and you don't really know what's going on. And increasingly, you're relying on some sort of default lifecycle assessment, emissions intensity factor, to just kind of, essentially guess what emissions are happening, far up, up your value chain, so to speak. And I guess I would argue, that can be an interesting exercise, which tends to be much more of a snapshot exercise, because again, you're making so many assumptions that somehow the amount you're spending on something is reasonably related to some emissions that are happening, again, far upstream. But if your goal is to set a target and track, and set a reduction target for your company and track those emissions over time, then the fact that you're using like a spend-based method, and you're using some sort of default factor from a lifecycle database, then when you think about it, the only way you can actually show emissions going down in your inventory is like spend much less money, right? Because those default factors from the lifecycle databases, if you're lucky, if they're updated once a decade, oftentimes not even that often. So you're not able to really reflect changes in emissions intensity. So even if your supplier like revamps and becomes much more energy efficient, your calculations aren't going to show that, and you're probably not going to know about it, because unless you're, how many of us are in touch with our supplier. So basically, you're only able to show it if you spend less money, or if you make like a major structural change, like you basically switch to like, I'm making my cars with aluminum, not steel anymore, like a major material structural change in like how you're doing something, where you literally shift from one default emission factor to a totally different one. So the point being is that you have to think about the, are you just doing an inventory because you just need to disclose something to CDP, or are you actually trying to track, manage your emissions and, and actively engage in like, doing specific actions to reduce them, in which case is the data you're collecting and the metrics you're using sensitive to the kind of changes that you think you might want to make. And again, a lot of this stuff far out into your supply chain, the inventory isn't really going to capture the kind of changes that you want to reflect.
That makes a ton of sense, and that's a fascinating way to think about it. That it's obviously the idea that spend will only be able to be reduced if you reduce your spend. So utilizing it that way has a huge limitation, but it is something that is a first step potentially for organizations that just have to get something reported. But obviously, where the goal of all of this reporting isn't just to report; it's to actually have impacts. So I think that's really a refreshing. It's a good way to frame that conversation.
Yeah, and I might just add just a so it's not to say, doing that kind of spend-based analysis, or just kind of doing this kind of what I'd call expansive life cycle assessment, of your quote unquote entire value chain. I mean, it's a useful exercise, and it's there's a reason it got it's in the GC protocol, and there's a reason at least initially they thought scope 3 made sense, but there's also a reason why it was sort of deprioritized, at least for the first well, now we're going on almost a couple decades of the GC protocol, is that essentially it can give you a snapshot of sort of like where the major emission sources are way farther up in your value chain, if it's done kind of more carefully. Oftentimes that's probably if you're just using one kind of default emission factor for like the entire value chain, like you're just, I'm procuring something, and I apply, whatever it is I'm spending money on, travel or whatever it is. I just apply one emission factor for that whole thing. Then you don't really know where in the value chain those emissions are coming from, right? Like, so it's even so you're taking a snapshot with a spend-based method, but if the goal is to then use that kind of snapshot, meaning and I say snapshot because you have that problem with it not really tracking changes over time very well. So it's really just kind of like trying to look at it at a moment in time, and you're really low resolution along your value chain, then the problem with that is like then if you want to go make an intervention like a little farther up in your value chain, like go to one of your supplier and actually say, hey, actually, it'd be great if you could do this instead of that, because it would lower your emissions, it would lower our emissions, all be happy. But that requires you kind of actually need to do a little bit more detail. You need to break down that value chain, like where are emissions, happening at which stage in the value chain, not just like, can't just treat that entire value chain as one big chunk, everything below you, everything above you. So again, that kind of points to, doing something that requires a little more effort. But yeah, I mean, doing a quick, spend-based snapshot, it, can still be useful, because at least then you can at least do that first slicing of like, which product category or which consumption category from stuff your business is procuring, which of those seems to be the bigger ones, and then you can like narrow it down and say, okay, I'm going to focus on these 3 major spend categories, and I'm going to break those down in more detail and look where in that value chain the emissions are coming from.
I want to jump into something else, but I do want to just ask one more question along these lines of spend-based. You mentioned databases where they might be able to find some of these spend-based emission factors. I know the EPA puts out some spend-based emission factors. Are there any other locations that organizations might want to look at that are probably the most reputable, or they might be able to find the most expansive, maybe that might be the most valuable if they did want to start with this initial snapshot type of view?
I mean, yeah, I would just say there's a list of resources on the GC protocol website, different LCA, kind of database, resources. And I would just look there. I mean, there's a couple dynamics that are sort of challenging here. Is the free resources on average tend to sort of, let's say, not be updated as frequently. um, uh, and then there's like kind of databases that managed by consultancies or something that you have to pay to get access to. And of course, because they're getting paid for, they I don't want to say they're in all cases better, but they tend to be trying to be updated a little bit more regularly. But then you're having to pay for it. So, and not all business want to have to do that. So that would be one kind of general, without pointing to a particular product. The other thing to think about is, at least in some countries, they have sort of national data sets, the US, Canada, UK, and a few others in Europe. So I would, depending on where your business is, I would focus on, or preferentially, tend to use data sets specific to those regions, because they'll tend to be built up more, kind of under those national circumstances, thinking about the kinds of, processes that are used in that country, and the kind of fuels or whatever that tend to be used. So they should be a little bit more representative on average.
That's great. With the organizations that we've worked with, they're definitely looking at the specific country-specific emission factor seems to be a great jumping off point. Kind of going in a different direction, but I think kind of along the same lines. One of the articles that you've written, the one about overlooking the mystery of missing greenhouse gas accounting principles, you mentioned the idea of TAC in terms of how an organization would go about their inventory. And I wanted to see if you'd be willing to jump in a little bit, expand on that thought process, and tell people what TAC stands for, and then kind of go into a little bit of each section, so that as an organization is thinking about their inventory, they might be able to think about how they might frame the process.
Yeah, sure. TAC is an acronym we came up with. This goes way back to the IPCC, what we call the National Inventory Guidelines, and the UNFCCC reporting in the early Kyoto days. And these are kind of like the quality principles, that preceded, all this stuff on corporate reporting. So TAC is transparency, accuracy, completeness, comparability, and consistency. And I can give a definition for each of those. Actually, if you look in the IPCC guidelines, where this comes from, transparency is actually listed as one of the last categories in terms of the principles, and it's just listed as just sort of one amongst many of them. But we kind of tried to reframe it when we started, teaching others on how to do this. Especially, this was highly related to the development of essentially the compliance inspection team certification and training process that we developed for the folks that go in and determined compliance at the country level for Kyoto. So think of it as like kind of nuclear weapons treaty compliance inspection, but this was just for for an environmental treaty. And we elevated in that, it was like we elevated transparency as sort of this meta principle, because essentially none of the other principles, accuracy, completeness, comparability, what we call consistency, but we specifically mean time series consistency, none of those really matter in that context of reporting and disclosure and compliance, if you don't have transparency, because you can't evaluate any of the other ones without the T, without the transparency. And that you need that in order to even think about any of the other ones from an external standpoint. So transparency is really the key one, and obviously that flows over into the corporate space just as much, because if we think of corporate reporting as at least maybe not exclusively but largely being related to disclosure to investors, to stakeholders, to others, then the same principle applies. And then maybe a couple more technical points. One is, again, the consistency. It's one of the things we looked at was people kind of throw around the word consistency loosely all over the place. like, well, we're consistent or this is consistent, without ever really explaining what they mean. The IPCC was really, really careful about this in defining it. Which we specifically mean time series consistency. So that means you can like look at a trend in the inventory over time, and that change over time is meaningful and consistent. There's no bias, statistical biases in those numbers make the trend meaning, sort of, unrepresentative of what's actually going on in the real world. Not other kinds of consistency. And then, the other one that if you line up the kind of principles that we see in corporate reporting, which are not exactly the same in the corporate reporting space. So, the GHG protocol has its own principles that somewhat align with the IPCC, but somewhat don't align. For example, corporate reporting principles exclude the principle of comparability. So although it's oftentimes assumed in a lot of venues that you can take one corporate report and compare it to another corporate report, meaning between two different companies. I'm not talking, so there's you can compare things over time, which is, again, we call time series consistency, but comparing two different companies and their reports, the whole corporate reporting framework is not intended to do that, even though for some reason, everyone assumes it is or acts like it is. So it's sort of not that you couldn't compare to, but again, the framework is not designed for that. It's not even a principle of the, when we think about like how all the rules and methodologies are developed, that's not even a consideration that went into it, really. So we have a little bit of a problem there. Again, in any case where a use case for corporate reporting where you are trying to compare to two different companies, for example, a lot of how they're used in investor disclosure spaces. And then lastly, since I can harp on this whole topic forever, if you haven't noticed, lastly, the principle of relevance is in the corporate reporting and is not in a lot of other kind of standards, including the IPCC doesn't include relevance, but it is included in the GHG protocol, which is interesting. I mean, on surface it makes sense. It's like, right, you want the data that is produced under the standard or protocol to be relevant, but the trick is it's sort of an odd thing to put into a standard when you think about it. In that, a standard should be kind of be clear on what it's relevant for in the first place, right? Like writing a standard saying, well, we're not really sure what it's relevant for, then you kind of have to like wonder whether or not that standard is a little bit too vaguely and broadly defined. Or at least the standard should be clear, under different use cases, the standard should be applied this way to make it relevant. But the current corporate reporting, in the GHG protocol doesn't really do that. It just sort of says, well, companies should just kind of like, kind of set their accounting boundaries and set their, methodologies and everything to be relevant to whatever they think they need to be relevant for. And so it's a little bit of I think it's somewhat at the heart of a lot of the challenges companies face, is that they're kind of left to their own devices to kind of figure out, why they're doing it, and then match up why they're doing it for sort of how they should do it without a lot of guidance, despite, all the stuff that's out there. There's surprisingly little guidance on how to, like, say I'm focused mainly on assessing my investor risk. Then what sort of, accounting approaches within the GHG protocol kind of, guidance, which choices should I make to specifically, best address, corporate reporting that is relevant for the purpose of assessing investor climate risk. And then I guess you can ask what kind of climate risk. And that's something, again, companies are just kind of left to their own devices right now.
Well, that's going to do it for part one of our conversation with Dr. Gillenwater. Stay tuned for our next episode where we take a deeper dive into strategies, explore some various protocols, and think about the best way to disclose information without impacting your firm's competitive advantages. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you get notified as soon as part 2 is released. This brings us to the end of another enlightening episode here at the Carbon Accounting and Management Podcast. We hope you found today's discussion insightful and that you're walking away with new ideas and actionable strategies. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or colleague, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on our latest episode. We also encourage you to join the conversation by rating this episode and sharing your comments and ideas with our community. If you have questions or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, we encourage you to email us at podcast@northstarcarbon.com. On behalf of myself, your host, Chris Barsman, and the entire North Star Carbon Management team, thank you for investing your time with us today. Until next time.